Toss aside the touchy-feely notions of love in business and recognize the real power it holds. Welcome to the Love is Just Damn Good Business podcast with host Steve Farber. Drawing on his work with a wide variety of companies from the Fortune 100 to smaller family-owned businesses, Farber shares inspiring interviews with business leaders and proven strategies for how you can create experiences that your customers will love by developing a culture that your employees, teammates, and colleagues love working in. Discover why and how love, at the end of the day, is just damn good business for you too. Here's your host, Steve Farber.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Love is Just Damn Good Business podcast. I am your host, Steve Farber. You can watch this podcast on video or listen to the whole thing or read a transcript of this whole episode or subscribe to it or all of the above at stevefarber.com/podcast. And you can find all of our other episodes there as well. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome Greg Harmeyer, who's the CEO and co-founder of Tier 1 Performance, which is an organization that is devoted to helping their clients create high-performing environments by focusing on their people, who of course are responsible for executing the company's strategies. And he comes out of the technology world. He was at Accenture for a time. He was one of the early consultants at A.F. Kelly Consulting Company, serves on the board of directors of American Red Cross, and has done a lot of great volunteer work and philanthropy work in his career. But here's what really rings my bells and why I asked Greg to be a guest on the podcast. Their culture at Tier 1 has been recognized as a best place to work by many best place to work lists, including Inc. in 2017 and 2018. The other thing that I found intriguing about Tier 1, and I want to hear more about, is Tier 1 is an employee-owned company. They are also a B corporation, and they were named a, quote, Best for the World honoree by the B Lab in 2019. And they have been on the Inc. 5,000 fastest growing companies list for not 1 year, not 2 years, not 3 years, not 4 years, not 10 years, but for 13 years. So we've got a lot to talk about. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to be with you, and I'm really excited to talk about some of the things on our plate today.
Great, excellent. So let's start with let's start broad and work our way in. Tell us a little bit about the Greg Harmeyer story. A little bit about your background and what brought you to where you are today.
Well, as you said, I started out as a technology consultant in my early years before it was even Accenture, and so kind of started my career in the IT field and in the consulting field, and fell in love with working with clients. Just love working with other organizations and trying to kind of solve their problems. One of the things I recognized pretty early on was technology is interesting, but people are way more interesting in terms of how organizations have success, what it takes to kind of drive growth and drive change. So much of it is about people and relationships and how they're treated and how they show up. And so that kind of got me into the people space, joined a small consultancy, as you mentioned, called A.F. Kelly, where I met ultimately met the other founders of Tier 1. And through some of those experiences, we gave a lot of kind of thought and energy towards what should a healthy culture look like? What does a great organization look like? What do we want out of work? And that was a big driver for starting Tier 1. People are always like, why'd you start Tier 1? And part of it was because wanted to work for a company that we felt good about working for. And
so you
what better way to do it?
The best way to do that is to build one.
Well, that was a big part of it. Is there were some, I think, some kind of hypotheses and beliefs about what a great, healthy organization could look like. And we knew that, sometimes it's hard to change an existing large organization. So maybe starting one would be the way to do it. And so in a lot of ways, we've talked about Tier 1 being kind of a grand experiment of those ideas for 18 years now, of trying to test out, like, how do you become a company that impacts people in a positive way and allows people to do great work and brings out their greatest talents. And so those have been driving forces behind some of what we've tried to do.
So tell us a little bit about what Tier 1 does, what your offerings are, and how you work with clients, et cetera.
Well, as you'd imagine, it's evolved over the years, but as we sit here today, we're about 250 people, and we work on strategy activation through people. So we work mostly with mid and large organizations. A lot of our clients you would know, Procter & Gamble and Delta Airlines and Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and big companies like that, on any strategic initiative that they have going on in their organization. So sometimes it's acquisitions, sometimes it's new product launches, but all of those strategic initiatives have to do with getting people to align, to believe, to buy into ideas, to know what to do, and to behave in a certain way. And so all of our work is around how do you make that happen. Some part of it's leadership alignment and consulting, and then a lot of it is just the execution of all those kind of key assets that touch people and help them understand what the organization needs out of them. So that's what we do. There's a whole layer of how we go about it.
If you had to put yourself into a kind of a generic category, would it be consulting? Would it be learning and development, organizational development, or all the above? Or how?
Yeah, a little bit of all the above. I would say it's an intersection between maybe an organization development consultancy, a training and development consultancy, and a design agency. So we bring a lot of principles of design in the broadest sense, but certainly visual design and creative engagement of people and experience design into our work. And so it's this intersection of creativity, technology, expertise on human performance, and expertise on adult learning.
So, for instance, if a company has a new product rollout, and they want to make sure that their people are aligned around it and they're going to execute on it to their fullest capacity, they might reach out to you for help in
Absolutely. The very common type of initiative we'd work on, new product launches, helping salespeople and customer service people position and support the new products. We do a lot of onboarding work. We do a lot of leadership development work. We do anything that has to do with how do you get people to perform at their best within the organization.
Okay. So going back to Tier 1's origin story that you started to share with us, where you guys, what are your co-founders' names?
Kevin Moore and Norm Damaris.
Okay, so you and Kevin and Norm got together and said, let's build a company that we would like to work for, that has the characteristics that ring our bells. So what are some of those characteristics? What did you strive to create?
Well, a few of the principles that were behind our desire to start something were we wanted to work at a place where people could bring their talents and do their best work, and we're unencumbered by like bureaucracy and red tape. So a lot of autonomy and a lot of trust to allow just people who were passionate about their work. So we have a high performance environment, people who want to work in the field, but unencumbered. A second thing was we wanted an environment that had a positive impact on people's lives, where you didn't feel like going to work was a drag, but it was a part of who you were as an employee for sure, but also on the people around us. So our communities, our clients, we wanted people to walk away from their relationships with us or their experiences with us and feel better for having been a part of it. And so there was this kind of, theoretical richness to the relationships that really mattered beyond just the transaction of the work.
So how did you build that in from the get-go?
I'd say from the very beginning, we started out trying to create a high trust environment. And so creating a space where people could come in, you hired people who were passionate about what they did, gave them the room to grow, and were very supportive of each other when things didn't go right. And as you know, in startups, things don't go right a lot. So we spent many years and most of them were our own fault, but we learned to live with, the issues and challenges and mistakes that were made. In our view, the only thing that mattered was that you got it right in the end. And so we always had to be committed to getting it right in the end. But we believed in that, punishing people was never really a good strategy. These were investments in people's development. So we started with that kind of mindset. And I think a lot of small companies start with that mindset. I think what happens sometimes is once you start scaling and growing, those ideas really get strained. The tension of the reality of challenging clients and challenging situations sets in, relationships become they become further apart just by the sheer number of people. And so trust starts to get pushed upon.
So you started out by hiring passionate people, giving them room to grow, supporting them and each other through those times where we're making mistakes. And you're right. What startup doesn't have like their scrapbook of the 10 greatest screw ups before we knew better? Is there any one of those that you remember that you'd care to share with us as a cautionary tale?
I don't know that there's anyone that seemed like they were daily back then, but we really learned to how much people will come to support you. And we felt like we saw that from every direction in a community and people around us, and even our own people who didn't even often know how stressed and how bad things were, but we're just super dependable. And that rooted into our culture, this idea of being dependable for others and being showing up for others.
And then, you pointed to the other, probably one of the biggest obstacles that any growing company has, which is you start with these wonderful ideas as the kind of culture you want to create. You hire the right people, and you're close to each other because you're literally close to each other. There aren't that many people to keep track of. But you guys have also been on that Inc. 5000 list for 13 years, which means you've been in growth mode for sounds like forever almost. So how have you done it? Or first of all, have you done it? Have you been able to maintain that culture that you originally set out to create? And if so, how have you done it as you've continued to grow?
I'd like to believe we have been able to maintain it, but probably a better way to say it is we've been able to evolve it. Like, culture isn't static, right? You have to continue to develop as you bring new people in, and they're in different geographies, and the way you work changes. And you have to be comfortable with that. You're always in this state of becoming something more and not be fearful of it. So if you're going to grow, you have to just recognize that things will change. That's part of growth. It's a organic thing. If you grow, by definition, you change, right? And so knowing like what do you hold on to deeply, I think has been a core thing, because the structures change, the processes change, how we communicate changes, all of it has to. But kind of knowing what the core is all about. And one thing, it's probably trite, but I think it just it doesn't get enough attention, is how critical it is to build trust in an organization, and how trust is even built. And I just don't think there's enough intentional thought to that, because if you have high trust in an organization, it's amazing what you can do. And if you don't, it's amazing how difficult things are. And so I would say that's the one common thread that we're always conscious about.
Yeah. And the conventional wisdom will tell you that it's easier to build and maintain trust when you have a smaller group of people. Mm-hmm. And of course, by now, I would hope that it's conventional wisdom that we all want organizations of trust. We all want cultures that are fundamentally, really anchored down in that feeling of reciprocal trust between management and employee, all the way across the board. But the bigger a company gets, the more I hear that presented as an issue. Obviously you hear it in small companies too. It's because there's no place to hide, and that becomes pretty obvious when there's no trust there. So as a company grows, if you can extrapolate, from your own experience with growing tier one and from the work you've done with clients, if somebody's listening to our conversation and they're struggling with that very thing, especially now, in the pandemic where people are not, they don't have the benefit of sitting down in the same room and breathing the same oxygen. What are some of the things that we should be paying attention to make sure that we keep evolving that trust and it gets better and deeper over time?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that hold true no matter what size you are. I think transparency is a huge one. The more you can share with everyone, the better. And if you can share everything, even better. Not because everybody cares about everything, but because if they know there's nothing to hide, it helps build some of that trust. I think a second thing is the recognition of the dynamics of trust, in the sense that, I mean, we all know it's a delicate thing. It's really hard to build trust, and it's incredibly easy to damage it. And so every action in every situation of tension and issue, how you handle it can be something that builds trust, or it can be something that creates significant damage. So just having leadership across the organization that's hyper conscious of that we're not just in the business of solving the problem. In the process, we're always in the business of creating this asset of trust or not. And everybody plays a role in that. I think creating an environment, I think a critical thing of any healthy culture is creating an environment where people believe that they are cared for as a person. And if people believe that, and it has to be true, like it's not an artificial thing. If people are truly cared for and feel it, I think that raises trust considerably. And so you look for the situations in times like this year. I think, transparency is big, explicit communication is big, because a lot of times you don't really know the answers. Some organizations, I think that causes people to not communicate. Well, we don't know exactly. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to say, we're not sure what the answers are, which can often be a mistake. I think just sharing what you know is critical to the development of trust as well.
Right. I was on I did a webinar for a Fortune 100 company just yesterday, as a matter of fact. There were 400 leaders online, and their senior vice president, who kicked off the session, said something like, our people, your people, our collective people need to feel valued. And then she went on to say, and this is one of the things you just said, Greg, she said, well, really, they need to feel valued because we actually value them.
Yeah.
And that always comes down to, what does that look like? So how do you show people that you value them? It's not enough to say, oh, I value you. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but what should that look like? So for you guys, one of the ways I'm inferring here, one of the ways you do that is you're an employee-owned organization. So quite literally, everybody is valued.
Yeah, everybody's an owner, and so that helps. That's one dimension, right? Because we are an employee-owned company, so everybody has a stake in the success of the organization. I think one way you show value is you truly engage with people and listen to them as to where they are, and all along the way, their ideas, their interests, their struggles. And when I say you, there has to be leadership throughout the organization that has that mindset, right? Because it can't, especially when you're talking about scaling an organization, it's never about one person or even a small group of people. It is what is felt. I always say that about our culture. It is what the people around you feel. That is what our culture is. So you are responsible for our culture, not me. I mean, it is how you make others feel, and a part of that is demonstrating that we are interested in people being a part of it for the long term. So we talk a lot about long-term thinking in our organization. Things are not about the transaction. They're not about winning the project. They're about the long-term impact. But those all have to do with helping create a sense of a person belonging and being valued.
And then I'm assuming, of course, that that's the same kind of thing you're helping your clients with, right? And is that thematically consistent in all the work that you do? Are there certain things that you're hoping that every client embraces, regardless of what project they're hiring you to help with?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. I would love to say that we have clients bringing us in to work on these explicit things all the time, and it's not the case, which is okay. They bring us in for all kinds of reasons. And our clients, as you would imagine, is because every company, they're across a spectrum of cultures and in terms of where they're at and their own organizations and the trust levels that exist or don't. when we step into them, we bring these mindsets and beliefs into our work. So sometimes it's very explicit because we're asked to. Other times we think we just have a chance to influence and to help shape and to help get them to pause and think, maybe operate a little bit differently. And it's very rewarding when you see, progress on those fronts.
So on the surface, it could sound like very different things to say, come help us with a product rollout versus come help us build trust in the organization.
Right. And the latter it's rare that someone would come to us that explicitly, right. But what they will say is, we need a more innovative culture, or we need a more agile or adaptive culture or organization. We're trying to shift to a different way of working. And when you peel back, you find like trust is at the center of your ability to do those things. So, or it'll show up in like, we want to create a more engaging onboarding experience where people really feel like they're connected. Well, there's some of these same principles apply. We want to create stronger leadership. Well, let's dig into it. It's not just a matter of training leaders. It's about helping create an environment where leaders can really thrive and make an impact.
Right.
So it gets woven into the work.
Yeah. So if a client actually wants to do those things, they're going to ultimately have to come to terms with how well are the underlying dynamics working or not. And in my experience, I'm wondering, how often you guys run up against this. A client will bring a consultant in. I've been on the receiving end of this, and I've witnessed it a lot over my 30 years or so doing this kind of work. A client will say, we want to build a better, higher performing team dynamic. And then you go in and you start to do the work and you peel it back and find that really the underlying issue is that very person that invited you in to fix the team dynamic. And then these are the things that perhaps you personally need to work on. And a lot of times, and I would like to think it doesn't happen as much as it used to, but I'm not convinced about that. There's this moment of truth where that person is either going to reckon with it or give up. And they still want the result, but they don't want to do what's necessary on their part to make that result happen. They thought they were hiring you to teach those people how to do that. And then when they're faced with it, oftentimes the response is, and this is a technical term, is I don't want to do that. You can't make me. Because they've always been this way. And look how much success I've had, and now you're asking me to change? Forget it. So do you guys run up against that kind of a dynamic in your work? And if so, over the years, because you've been doing this for a long time, do you think people are becoming, when I say people, I mean senior leadership, are they becoming more or less receptive to the, let's call it the people, the personal dynamics necessary to implement technology and strategy and everything else?
Yeah, so we absolutely run into those dynamics. And a related one, I think, is, I think you particularly see that on strong leader organizations, mid-sized companies where there's a strong dominant personality. Maybe they were the founder of the company, or and that becomes a really critical piece. And you see it in large organizations too. In larger organizations, the other thing I think you see is the complexity of their historic culture and bureaucracy that sometimes drives systems a different direction than where they say they want to go. And so, but either way, I think we do wrestle through these realities of, I've said before, like culture change isn't complex. If you want to change culture, you got to change leaders. That's what makes it hard. And all of us as leaders are flawed. We're humans. So we're on these individual growth journeys of our own, trying to lead journeys of an organization. And it is a challenge. So I do think there's a great deal of awareness to it. I would say my own experiences in the past, 5 to 10 years, more and more organizations are awakening to the demand of a healthier culture that's more vibrant. And it quickly becomes clear that it is leaders that create that. So simply recognizing those realities is important. But it definitely starts with senior leaders and and at least their willingness to be vulnerable and look at themselves as part of the situation as much as anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Vulnerability, of course, has become in recent years a word that we're hearing more in organizations. A lot of it has to do with Brené Brown's work, but there's a lot of people that have been talking about this for a lot of years, that leaders need to be vulnerable. It ties into transparency and personal transparency and everything else. So it's become one of those things that I've always been sensitive to, which is when something becomes a buzzword or part of our business lexicon, there's a tendency oftentimes to confuse the use of the vocabulary word with the actual thing itself. So if I'm really good at talking about vulnerability and how important it is, I don't actually have to be vulnerable because people will think that I am. And so there's always this kind of gap, I think, between buzzword and behavior. So for example, empowerment was the huge buzzword for how many years. And I used to do a riff on this in some of my talks where, what empowerment is supposed to be is giving people, discretion and control over their work. And what it looks like in a lot of places is, I waggle my fingers at you and I say, "Hoogie boogie boogie, you're empowered. Go out there and make decisions. But before you make any decisions, check with me and don't screw it up." But over the years, I think more people have come to understand what empowerment really means. So is there anything, any of these human dynamics that you're seeing where there is still a gap between the language that you see companies use and the behavior associated with it? Does that make sense? There's kind of a meandering.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on. I think I think it is true with vulnerability. And I actually think it's probably still true with empowerment in a lot of ways. There is this, I think it's easy for us as leaders or anybody who's been really competent at what they do and had success in what they do to recognize what is theoretically good, but in their own situations do it differently, right? Yeah, I need to create space for other people, but in this case, I know better than that person does, and they're not really sure what they're doing, right? So, and there's always an easy human nature rationalization of those things, and I think that's the tension that fights against creating the cultures that we sometimes want, because we have to, the big risk and vulnerability I think you have to take is I don't actually agree with what that person's wants to do. And I'm okay explaining to them why, but if they insist upon doing it, I'm also okay letting them go. And then helping, and if it screws up, not blaming them and not saying I told you so, but rather being there to support them. That is where I think it gets really challenging. And that's where I think you start to really get more trust built and more growth. So I think that's a space, and it's related to empowerment, which is I think a critical element today, because so many organizations want to be more agile and they want to be more adaptive and they want to be more client-centered and more responsive. All those things require letting go of stuff and letting other people do the work.
Yeah, Intel had an adage for quite some time. I think they still refer to it, at least occasionally. They called it disagree and commit. So the idea there, the culture was that if I have an idea, your job is to tear it apart, be critical of it. If I'm your boss and I say, here's what I think we should do, you have every right in the world to disagree with me on it. And we're going to kick it around. And then when all is said and done, I'm still going to make the decision. And when I make that decision, the agreement is that you commit to it. So disagree and commit, which is a wonderful concept. What it looks like with some leaders is, okay, go ahead, disagree. Okay, fine. Okay, I'll commit.
Right. We have a little bit of I wouldn't say inverse, it's related, but one of our principles is the person closest to the client makes the call. So it's not necessarily the most senior person, and in fact, it's often not. And that same kind of principle of dialogue will happen, because the second principle we have is check your thinking. So don't go make the call without checking your thinking with someone. but they might check their thinking with me. I may have a different viewpoint. In the end, it's still their call. That's a really hard principle to hold to. To kind of to your point, it's an easy one to talk about. It's a really hard one to live with. Another, I think, example of what you're asking, like where else do we see this? I think you see it in innovation spaces a lot. Everybody says, well, we have to be willing to fail. We have to be, have a culture that allows for failure. How many companies are really good at doing that, and how many leaders are, because the pressure that they feel from their company is questionable. I mean, that's a really difficult space. Everyone knows you're supposed to do it, but being able to do it is another thing.
Yeah, every business book that you will ever pick up says that we should encourage people to try and make mistakes and support them in their failures, like you guys strive to do from the very beginning of Tier 1, right? And again, that's conceptually, that's a great thing. But if I tell you, hey, go ahead, make mistakes, and then you do, and then I spend all my time trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with you, or who can we blame? Who can we blame this for? It's all of this stuff is much easier to talk about than it is to do, but that doesn't excuse us from trying to do it, and myself included, by the way. So you mentioned a couple of the principles that you guys operate by. Do you have a set of articulated principles or values? Yeah,
we have both, and we have an operating model we call dynamically distributed authority, and it's this idea that authority is distributed and it's dynamic and contextual to the roles you're playing. And we have some basis for what that operating model is built upon. One of them is this idea is that it's principle driven, not policy driven. So we don't have a lot of rules, but we do try to articulate principles around many of the things that we do. And I cited a couple to you. Another is this notion of measure to align. So we use data a lot, but it's not to beat people up. It's to align on expectations so that you and I are talking about the same thing, and we can look and say, what were the actual results of something? So we use principles a lot to drive our thinking. I could rattle off a lot of them. We also do have stated values and this notion of values in action, which ultimately look like principles like I'm in the game, meaning I'm all in, I'm part of this all the time, I'm not standing on the sidelines judging others. I bring my whole self to work, so I'm not a different person at work than I am at home. And so these are some of the kind of principles that we try to bring in to help give people a perspective of who we are and kind of how we think about things.
We may be getting a little bit into the weeds, a little nerdy on some of this, but what's the distinction that you're making between values and principles?
Yeah, so we articulated our values years and years ago as kind of a framework or of the things that define the boundaries of what we care about. Okay, so for us, it's like high performance and relationships, accountability, fun. I mean, these are pretty generic words. I mean, some people will be like, well, this could be anybody's values, right? For us, we'd say it's the intersection of the six that really provides a boundary. So high performance and relationships, like we've got to do great work, and in the process, people have to have high quality relationships in the end. Those are kind of frameworks of the things that we really care about. Principles for us are more insights that help us shape decisions we make. Like I said, this idea of the person closest to the client makes the call. It's like that rather than having 100 rules about who has what authorities, that simplifies them into kind of an elegant way to make a decision.
And so can you lay those out for us, what the principles are?
Well, I shared a few of them. And the thing about it is we have principles in a lot of different situations. So what I shared there is kind of some of the operating principles we have. One of them is embrace the assignment. So you might not love the work that's being assigned to you, but we are a consulting organization. And so there's something to be learned and delivered from every situation you step into. So those are some operating principles. We have principles around other types of situations. So for instance, we have a model for how we support individuals. We call it personalized associate experience, or PAX. And one of the principles is find a yes. So if somebody needs support on something, we may not be able to do exactly what they want to do, but we can find a way to say yes to it. So there are a number of different kind of contextual situations that we have different principles articulated for.
That's a hell of a principle, I got to say. We could all benefit from the practice of that one. And when I say we can all, I mean capital W, we, capital A, all, especially nowadays. What a wonderful practice to try to find that. Yes. Now you hit a little button for me. You said something like, you may not love the work you're assigned to, but you need to embrace it. So let's explore that word for a minute. Now I have it on pretty good authority, my internal intel of the inner goings on at Tier 1, that you, Greg, have actually been known to use the word love from time to time in talking about your business and your employees and your colleagues. Is that true?
It is true, and I love that you've written a book on it, so you know probably more about this than anybody. But I think we probably share a common belief there and how important it is.
So So talk a little bit about that. What does love mean to you in the Tier 1 business and in business as a whole?
So one notion, obviously it's a big word and means a lot of different things to different people in different ways, but one notion I think is the idea of the well-being of the individual is of primary importance in and of itself. Before we worry about how they're performing, before we worry about what the value they create in the company, the well-being of the individual is of primary concern to all of us. And we want them to know and feel that, but even if they don't know or feel it, it's still true. A related idea, I think, is we sometimes talk about this conditional employment, unconditional compassion. So love for us means we care about you as a person independent of what it means to the organization. And we're going to have unconditional compassion for you as a person. May not mean you work here forever. And that may be the right thing. That may be the loving things to help you realize this is the wrong place.
Exactly.
But if we start with an authentic care for you as a person, really everything is better as a result of that for all kinds of reasons, some of which we've kind of started to talk about. There's greater trust in the organization. There's greater commitment. There's greater engagement. And our work overall is more meaningful. We're making an impact in people's lives. And that is a central thing. From our viewpoint, there's a principle of organizations exist to serve people, not the other way around. And I think sometimes companies and organizations get lost in that the people are fortunate to work here and have jobs. And while that from an individual standpoint, that may be true and probably is true, the organization exists as an act of service to others. And those others may be customers and certainly are customers, but they're also employees who are customers in a different way. So it's just that notion of love kind of threads through all of that.
Yeah. So why do you think it is that that so many people, or at least the stereotype is that so many business people get a little squirrely around that language in the context of business?
I think we've been indoctrinated into an economic system that has steered us away from it. And I think you're seeing certainly a dialogue, if not a reckoning about that, right, in the past recent years. But if you go back, 50 plus years, we have a kind of capitalism mindset, and I am a capitalist through and through, that was driven about shareholder results, pure and simple. And there was this belief that if we have an objective focus on that, then that's all an organization has to do. And I don't think that's true, healthy, or actually even realistic, because if you want shareholder results, I think you have to have a focus on others. And so I think in recent years, there's been more realization, but most leaders today were indoctrinated in a mindset of like, it's all about the business. It's all about the bottom line. It's all about kind of financial results. And everybody here is in service to those financial results as opposed to everybody being shared.
And there's an implied, if not overt, mindset that says that those are mutually exclusive. that you have to do one or the other. It's either a bottom line focus or creating an environment that people love working in, as if somehow those are at odds with each other. Whereas if I could be so presumptuous as to quote myself, love is just damn good business. What does that mean? It means if you operationalize it, it's good business, which means it reflects on the bottom line all the way down to shareholder value, et cetera. That's what I've seen in my work. I mean, obviously, I have a strong opinion about that, but it sounds like when you guys go into organizations, you may not. Again, it's not necessarily about the vocabulary words. You may not be using the vocabulary words, but what you're helping your clients to do is to create that environment of value and trust. And when we start calling it love, in my experience, it raises the expectations. It doesn't make it soft and fluffy. It actually makes it more difficult, because that's a much higher, more difficult standard to live up to than just, quote unquote, good performance. How about performance that your clients are going to love? That sets the expectation way higher.
I 100% agree with that. And that, I think use of that term and that idea of love does raise the expectations. It gets people's attention, and it's a deeper thing that you can't just throw around. You got to really think about what you're saying. And, I'd probably say I've only started using it in conversations inside our organization, maybe in the past 5 years or so, but it maybe without fully recognizing it at the time. I think that is why, because it felt like we have to have a deeper discussion of what we're really talking about. And what we are talking about is putting people at the center of our work. Work is not a transaction. It is something that is deeply humanistic, and we have a chance to have an impact on people's lives. And if you start with that point, in today, this year, this is more central and important than ever. And in a good way, I think a lot of companies have really risen to the challenge. So I've been really impressed to see how many organizations have stepped up. But putting the human being at the center of what work is about, as opposed to all the specifics of transactions. And if you do that over the long term, you'll get a lot of things right.
Beautifully said. I'm just curious. You said you started using this language about 5 years ago or so internally at Tier 1. Do you remember when people at the company first heard you use those words? Do you remember how they responded?
I would say I got a lot of immediate positive affirmation. There was a couple of things. I wrote some things about it, and at a company meeting, I talked a little bit about it. And I think the concepts touched people a little more deeply maybe than other language that had been used. Again, it gets to the human aspect of it gets more deeply to the human aspect of what we're talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons it's a powerful word and a powerful concept and a powerful belief.
So is it fair to say then that the overall response was primarily positive versus shocked or negative?
Yeah, absolutely fair to say that about the explicit response. I can't say if there were people who were uncomfortable and saying, like, what's he talking about, that didn't come forward, because that could have happened as well. And sometimes that will happen, right?
Sure.
Like, that's a part of being, as well as anyone, that's a part of being a leader, is like you have to be willing to continue to move the conversation and dialogue and mindset forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a rather generalized answer. You're not going person by person and saying yes, no, yes, no.
Right.
But just in terms of your own experience, and because you know how it is when you communicate something, you get a hit as to whether or not you're connecting. And I'm going to make I can't prove this, but I'm going to make not a prediction, but an analysis here. I would bet that the reason you had a more positive response when you used that language for the first time is because people already saw evidence that it was true in the environment that you had, in the way that you lead, in their experience of working at Tier 1. If you were, again, a technical term, if you were an asshole to people and started talking about how important love is, then it's going to, you get a different response.
Yeah, right.
Now,
I'd like to believe that's true as well, and I think it is. And as you know, like the humanity side of it is really important too. It was just, I think we've got a good environment, and I think we've got a loving, caring environment, and we don't get everything right. Right? You're going to their experiences. I certainly don't, and across the organization we don't. And so that's a part of it too. Is like the notion of love is bigger, of like it's forgiving too, right? And there's grace involved, and we don't have enough grace in our world today.
So true. I mean, listen, love looks very different at work than at home. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. As you said earlier, they're different. It means different things in different contexts and all of that. But there are some parallels. Like, for example, to what you just said, I think if you asked my wife, there are times where she probably wasn't particularly happy with what I did, but I think it's fair to say that she still loves me.
Right.
Love, I mean, it does transcend that, and there is such a thing as tough love. There is such a thing as that dynamic that you were talking about earlier between love and compassion for an individual and love for the business. And sometimes those two things don't line up, and I might need to liberate somebody to find their passion elsewhere, because that's the best thing for them and the best thing for the organization. So yeah, sure, it's complex. But I got to tell you, Greg, I love the facility of language that you have and that your team obviously has, where you're taking these principles and you're taking very, very meaningful, very deep dynamics of humanity and framing them up in a way that just makes beautiful sense in a business context. So I want to thank you for spending this time with us. And if somebody wants to connect with you and learn more about Tier 1, what's the best way? And we'll make sure to put all the links and everything in the post. But where can they find you?
Yeah, well, our website's tier1performance.com. Tier, the number 1performance.com. My email is the easiest way, g.harmeyer@tier1performance.com. And love these conversations, Steve. And love exploring these ideas with people, because it helps shape our thinking and our growth and the way we move forward. So appreciate you having me, and appreciate the input from others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm telling you, our listeners are passionate about this subject. That's why somebody tunes into a podcast that's called the Love is Just Damn Good Business Podcast, not because they think it's a bunch of crap, but because they want to understand better how to do it. And so I imagine you're going to have some great conversations with folks. So thanks for being with us, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Love is Just Damn Good Business Podcast. And until next time, do what you love in the service of people who love what you do.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Love is Just Damn Good Business with Steve Farber. Join us again next time, because when customer and employee satisfaction just isn't enough anymore, we are here to back you up with specific ideas to operationalize love to make an enormous difference in your business, personal life, and the world around you. Visit our website at stevefarber.com to leave a review. And don't forget to share the love with your colleagues and friends, because after all, it's just damn good business.